Good evening. Our next speaker, originally from England, now resides in Dallas, Texas, and is the author of many UFO and related genre books. Those titles include A Covert Agenda, The FBI Files, Cosmic Crashes, Strange Secrets, On the Trail of the Saucer Spies, and Contactees. Nick also currently writes for Fortean Times, Fate, Paranormal Magazine, and he has a regular column in UFO Magazine titled View from a Brit. He also written for Military Illustrated and the British Daily Express and People newspapers. Nick has appeared on a variety of television shows, including UFO Hunters, UFO Invasion at Rendlesham, the BBC's Out of This World, and Countdown with Keith Olbermann, and is a frequent guest on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie. Please let me welcome to the stage to talk about crop circles, Mr. Nick Redfern.
Thanks, John. Thanks a lot. Well, thanks everybody for that introduction. As John said, tonight I'm going to be speaking about crop circles, which isn't a subject really that I lecture on to a great deal, although it's a subject I'm very interested in and that I've undertaken a lot of research into. And I guess, unlike a lot of aspects of the UFO subject and related phenomena, the crop circle field, I guess, no pun intended, is one of those areas that really sort of polarizes people into different camps. There's the extraterrestrial theory, you have the so-called Gaia theory, the notion that crop circles are actually some sort of manifestation of a psychic force from the Earth itself. And then, of course, you know, there's the theory that nobody wants to hear about, of course, the hoaxing theory. Now, people ask me, do I feel there's a definitive alien aspect to crop circles? And my answer to that question is yes, I do, with 100% certainty. Like Linda, when Linda was talking about time travel, you know, coming into play in Rendlesham, my view on crop circles, I'm not entirely sure that the definition of alien as it relates to crop circles means extraterrestrial. Does it mean interdimensional? Is it some sort of paranormal, psychic phenomena we don't understand? I'll be the first to admit I truthfully don't know, but I do believe that we can rule out just the simplistic notion of people running around fields with boards. Now, that's not to say that doesn't happen. It does. But if you ask me, do I think there's another aspect to the phenomenon as well, there's absolutely no doubt about that at all. Now, as John said, I live in Dallas, Texas, but as you can probably tell, this isn't a Dallas, Texas accent. It's, I can say howdy partner, but it doesn't kind of sound the same as it does for a native, I suppose. I lived here for 10 years, but prior to that, lived in England, a country where I guess everybody thinks we sit around drinking tea when it rains all the time, which is kind of a bit of an exaggeration. But the reason I mention people make that assumption is because people also make a lot of assumptions about English crop circles. And what I'd like to do for you tonight is sort of dispel some of those assumptions, but also reveal to you some information and data that I know you won't have seen before, that puts the whole crop circle phenomenon in a completely brand new light, in a very positive light as well, and talk about historic government involvement and investigations of crop circles, actually going back to the Second World War, and also look at this angle of the human aspect of crop circle making, why these people do it, and also kind of open you up to another world of this human aspect, and also demonstrate that far from being just a recent phenomenon, it's actually one that dates back several centuries, if not even longer. In fact, in England at least, for as long as there's been recorded words, there have been notions and mentions of crop circle type phenomena. And I first got interested in crop circles probably around 1989. And crop circles, round about that period, 89, 90, the whole phenomenon really took off big time in Britain. One of the reasons being that Britain is a very small country. I mentioned I live in Texas. England, Scotland and Wales combined, the square mileage is actually smaller than the state of Texas. That's actually how tiny Britain is. But the country itself has a population which is a full 20% of America. So in other words, you have a very large population in a small landlocked country. And what that basically means is that when something happens on the news, everybody gets to hear about it. It's not like something happens in LA and somebody in New York doesn't hear of it. Overnight, something's the talk of the country. And that's what happened with the crop circle phenomenon. And probably most summers from about 1989 to about 2000, I would go down to Wiltshire, which is one of the main counties in England where the crop circles appear every year. There has been sort of this mistaken mythology, I guess, that Wiltshire is the only place where the crop circles appear, which actually isn't the case at all. They literally appear all over the place. But it's certainly Wiltshire is the one county more than any other that, I guess, attracts crop circles or attracts the phenomenon that is responsible for the crop circles. Now, one of the things I found doing the crop circle investigations when I began was that everything was kind of very much black and white. There were crop circles and it's A, B or C that's carrying out the phenomena, that's creating the phenomenon. And I would say I followed that approach for 5 or 6 years. And then as time progressed, I began to realize there were other subtleties to the subject, other things going on that weren't necessarily apparent at the time, and that really took me into some strange paths. And they're pathways that you don't very often hear very much about within the crop circle community. And I'm not really sure why that is. It may be just because some of the aspects are just so plain weird and strange that they don't seem to fit in one particular category or box. So in that respect, they've been kind of sidelined. And we hear a lot about crop circles and these glowing balls of light flying around, but certain other aspects, which I'm going to talk about, we simply don't hear of that much. So again, as I said, what I want to try and do for you is not give the definitive explanation to what crop circles are or aren't, but to give you my own details, my own experiences, and some of the conclusions I've come to based on, I guess, 10 years worth of road trips travelling around the English countryside in search of the truth about crop circles. Now that is a classic circular crop formation. I put that one up as the first one for several reasons. I'm originally from a county in England called Staffordshire in central England, and that's where that one was found. I'm going to talk about that one a little bit later on. I've included that one as well because it's actually built or constructed on the side of a hill. And of course, when people talk about the hoaxing elements, it's one thing to suggest that somebody may be able to make one of these formations on a nice area of flat land. That one is actually kind of a rolling hill, it goes like that. But again, it was a perfect formation, very symmetrical. As you can see, it fills almost 3 aspects of the field between the so-called tram lines, as they call them. That one appeared in 2006, and I was back over in England at the time, and so decided to check it out as it wasn't too far from where I was staying. And again, this is sort of typifies that, if we're looking for crop circles in England, we don't just necessarily focus on the county of Wiltshire, even though that is, I guess, the predominant capital of crop circles throughout the world, I would say. What I'm going to do for you, I'm just going to sort of pick issues at random that I think are going to be of interest to you, and hopefully brand new material as well. I think if you're going to come to a conference, you don't want somebody going solely over old ground. You want to have something new to take back with you. And one of the things that's been spoken about to a great extent within the crop circle community and research field is the whole issue of whether or not and to what extent government agencies take an interest in crop circles, the more elaborate pictograms, and associated phenomena like the strange glowing balls of light that many people have seen zipping across the crop circles and hovering over them, and in some cases even reportedly making them. Well, in August 1989, an article appeared in the Wall Street Journal, and I'll just quote this for you. British agriculture and defence officials want to know more about the mysterious crop circles which have appeared across the countryside. So does Queen Elizabeth, who is said to have sharply questioned Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher about the circles recently. While those talks are kept secret, a Buckingham Palace spokesman says the Queen took a hurriedly published book about the circles to her summer palace in Scotland this month. So I won't say this was necessarily the first inkling we had of official interest, but it was one of the early ones. There were certainly reports in the 1980s of British Army and military helicopters flying over fields where crop circles were seen. But then the Army said, well, you know, these are our boys on their day off and they're as interested in you are, so, you know, they're taking the helicopters up and having a look. So, you know, you can look at that from two angles, I guess. But another person who commented on the whole angle of government secrecy and investigations was George Wingfield, who was Eton educated and employed at the Royal Greenwich Observatory. And Wingfield stated that in September 1990, the British government called a secret ministerial briefing to debate the matter of the mysterious formations in the fields. And according to Wingfield's sources, the meeting was supposedly convened to try and determine the nature of the crop circles in case the government was placed in the embarrassing position of being asked about them and having to say, well, yeah, they're out there, but we have absolutely no idea what's going on or where these formations are coming from or who's doing it. That was the last thing they wanted. Now, since then, there have been other rumours, allegations, stories, etc., as to what's going on at an official level. Are government agencies watching us as we're watching the crop circles, etc.? And not a great deal has come out into the public domain, but there is something which I'm going to give you a little scoop on, and that is a certain amount of very significant government files which have surfaced from an arm of the British intelligence community called MI5. And MI5 is the British equivalent of the FBI, which means it does all the domestic, internal espionage operations. It's like over here, the FBI works inside the US, the CIA is responsible for spying on Russia, Iraq, whoever. And in England, MI6 works overseas, MI5 works inside the country. And a lot of people who've chased down this angle of government investigations of crop circles, one of the big problems, as I'm sure people like Stan Friedman will tell you, is that when you go to government archives, if you're looking for information on a particular thing, you don't necessarily look up UFO, and if there's nothing there, walk away. You know, for example, if somebody, you know, Professor John Smith was contracted by the Air Force to do UFO research in the 40s, you see if there are files on Professor John Smith. Now, going through a number of MI5 files that have been declassified right back from the days of the Second World War, we found a number of files which didn't refer to crop circles directly by that name because the term simply didn't exist at back in the 1940s. What these files referred to were circular areas of flattened corn in fields all across mainland Europe that British, Polish and French aircraft pilots had seen as they were flying to Germany to bomb Germany. And these were by definition crop circles. Now, I'll quote one of these particular MI5 documents. Now, for people who are wondering, these aren't leaked documents, they're not questionable documents. They've surfaced through the terms of the British government's Freedom of Information Act. And this is a 1942 document from MI5. The early days of 1940 and 1941 produced an avalanche of reports about spies and fifth columnists who many people thought were roaming the land unhindered. Each village boasted of enemy agents in their midst, and it is only by recapturing the atmosphere of those days that one can see the matter in its proper perspective. Everyone had heard activities of fifth columnists on the continent and of the alarmingly successful part they had played in the overthrow of France and Belgium. It was therefore natural, with everyone tense for the threatened invasion, that so many reports came in. Each had to be investigated, even if only to put the minds of the public and the services at rest. And it's in this particular file that we find these reports on the crop circles. And it continues. This account is not concerned with the activities of fifth columnists such as sabotage, capturing airfields and key points, and harassing the defending enemy, but in the methods used in communicating to each other and to the enemy. Reports from Poland, Holland, and France and Belgium showed that they used ground markings for the guidance of bombers and paratroops and of lights by night. Such ground markings might be the cutting of cornfields into guiding marks for aircraft. And they added that MI5 concluded that German pilots, Luftwaffe pilots, were, quote, beating out signs 20 meters in diameter on harrowed fields or mowing such signs and formations on meadows or cornfields. So in other words, they're talking about crop circles. But MI5 had come to the conclusion that all these crop circles and intricate formations that bomber pilots were reporting seen over Germany, well, it has to be the work of the Germans. They came to this, I guess, which is an intriguing conclusion that, you know, bear in mind there wasn't much talk about aliens in the Second World War. You know, everybody was busy fighting the war. But they came to the conclusion that this particular formation, like a circle with an arrow and a star or a line going one way, was the equivalent of meaning bomb London at midnight, flying from the southwest at 1,000 feet. Now, there was never actually any evidence presented to prove that theory. It was simply an idea that MI5 concluded. The ironic thing is that the Germans were seeing these formations also, and they thought they were coded messages left by the British. So, in other words, everybody was seeing these formations in the fields, and everybody thought it was the other person making them, which is a clear indication that it was neither. Now, these files, I guess, are important because they demonstrate several things. One being that we can now officially prove that there has been deep investigations of crop circles by the British government. And not only that, MI5 was so concerned by these formations in the fields, what they covertly started flying aircraft over southern England, checking out the fields there for any formations that appeared on British soil. So, in other words, this was an early definitive investigation, a top secret investigation by one of Britain's most secretive intelligence agencies of unusual formations in the crop. And now anyone can access these files at the National Archive, which is based just outside of London. And there's another important thing. In these documents, it talks about, in the daytime, they thought that the German pilots were using these formations as a message, you know, they could see them from the ground. But at night, they said the Nazis were using some sort of light phenomena to send messages to their air crews. Now, of course, when you have crop circles and light phenomena together, well, that's exactly what we get today. We have the crop circles, the pictograms, and we have these small balls of light flying around the fields. So what we can take from these MI5 files is that 60-something years ago, people were seeing in the fields across Europe crop circles and strange balls of light. And today we're seeing crop circles and strange balls of light. So in other words, this phenomenon that the media and the skeptics tell you is a brand new one and just done by guys leaving the pub on a Friday night has actually been with us for 65 years and has been the subject of deep intelligence interest on the part of at least several agencies and the military. Now, I mentioned that a lot of the crop circles today are found in Wiltshire, and people say, well, why Wiltshire? What's special about Wiltshire? That's the entrance to MI5. It doesn't look anything special, but that's about as close as you can get to it before being hauled inside, and that's why you're taking photographs outside. But so if you ever go there, get a quick picture and then sort of walk off quickly as well. That's a close-up one I took, just to demonstrate, you know, I think sometimes when you see pictures on the internet, you see these huge, nice formations. You don't always necessarily appreciate the detail that you get in a close-up picture, you know, and you can see the intricate designs in some of these smaller offshoots and arms that the formations have. Now, as to why, you know, it should be in Wiltshire. Now, a lot of people point to the fact that Wiltshire is a very ancient county, and it's home to Stonehenge and the Avebury Circle. So in other words, it has a lot of historical, archaeological value to it, and people suggest, because ancient man viewed it as a very spiritual county, that's why the circle makers are attracted to this area today. And I'm going to talk about that more in a bit, because there's no doubt I think that plays a role in it. But there's also a deep, top-secret military aspect to Wiltshire as well, that again isn't always necessarily appreciated when we're talking about why this phenomena is coming to Wiltshire. That's the National Archive, where you can find the all the records on MI5's crop circle investigations. Now that's the entrance to a place called Boscombe Down. Boscombe Down is located in Wiltshire, and it's where the British military undertake a lot of deep research into prototype aircraft and new and advanced radical technologies. So, you know, if you have any sort of visiting alien, non-human intelligence, one of the places they might want to check out is Boscombe Down. Porton Down, that's the British equivalent of Fort Detrick in Maryland over here, where a great deal of research is undertaken into biological warfare, bacteriological warfare, viruses, chemical warfare. And there are a number of stories about crashed UFOs in England, which talk about bodies from crashed UFOs having been taken to this location, Porton Down. Now, if UFOs have crashed in England, Porton Down, which is quite literally in the centre of, in crop circle central, if you like, would be the ideal place, because if you have some sort of exotic extraterrestrial body, you don't know, if it contains any lethal, potentially lethal viruses that the human race simply could not fend off. Would have no defence against them. Porton Down would be the ideal place to take them, because this is where you have the scientists and the technicians who are used to dealing with, as I said, highly virulent viruses, diseases, etc. And a British researcher who died a few years ago, Tony Dodd, he was given a story about a number of alien bodies in a UFO crash in 1974 being taken to Porton Down. There's even a story, granted I won't say it's a friend of a friend story, but it's been difficult to prove, but it's an interesting story about how supposedly in the 1990s a crop circle actually appeared on Porton Down land. Now, because of the nature of the work that's undertaken at Porton Down, it's obviously a very, very secret installation, heavily guarded, not the sort of place you just go strolling into unless you want a bullet in each kneecap, I guess. And I may be talking literally nowadays, with the whole situation in the world. But this particular story about the Porton Down crop circle is that it actually appeared inside the fence, inside the perimeter of the base. And the story is that a number of security guards saw this small circle out in the field, which actually started to grow. And it was getting bigger and getting more intricate, and they're having to move back. And apparently there was like a group of about 15 or 20 military guys surrounding it, all kind of having to slowly and steadily move further away as this was growing. And reportedly, somebody came scrambling out the base with a camera and managed to get as much of it on film as they could. And then it suddenly stopped. It was just like a literal formation in the field. But now, of course, because it happened on base, this film footage, if it's real, if it exists, has certainly never surfaced. But a number of researchers in the county of Devonshire, friends of mine, heard this story firsthand in the 1990s and were convinced that it was a genuine story, that the source, whose background was verifiable, was speaking truthfully. So, people talk about how these formations can suddenly appear quickly with no people in sight, and not even, like a large craft or anything like that hovering overhead, but just through means we don't really understand. And I guess this Porton formation, if genuine, would be a perfect example of how that could occur. Now, another place in Wiltshire is this one, RAF Rudloe Manor. RAF Rudloe Manor kind of looks like just a quaint little English village there, but those are the main buildings on the surface. I say on the surface because the whole area, many, many years ago, was quarried out underground to build the nearby city of Bath. There's a particular stone in Bath called Bath Stone, and it was all quarried out of this area. So when all the rock was removed, you had this huge underground area. And in the 1950s and 60s, the government had the bright idea that in the event of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union at the time, the government would need some sort of continuation place to try and continue the government. So the idea was that, when the 4-minute warning goes off, the Queen, the Prime Minister and everybody else get shuttled quickly if they're in the area at the time, which they probably would have been anyway if it was a heightened state of emergency, and they would be placed into this huge underground installation, which actually goes down about 200 feet. It's a huge installation, while the rest of us would be left to fry upstairs, unfortunately. So but the interesting thing is that everybody in town, in the local area, knew about the base, and they all said, you know, if the warning ever goes up, we'll just storm the base and get in anyway. So, but the point I'm coming to is that Rudloe has this huge underground installation. One of the rumours is that this is from where the government and the military undertook its classified UFO investigations. The Ministry of Defence in London has an office which does investigate UFOs. This is the one that Nick Pope worked in. But there have always been rumours of higher and deeper investigations of UFOs. And some of these we know for a fact because a number of documents have surfaced, probably by mistake, from an office called the Provost and Security Services, which investigated UFOs for many, many years, and it's kind of like the Air Force Office of Special Investigations over here. And their headquarters was at Rudloe Manor until 1998. And so they were, I guess, at the forefront of UFO investigations. A number of military people have come forward to say that they saw alien bodies in cryogenic storage in this deep underground installation at Rudloe. So, in other words, right in this county where today it's heavily dominated by crop circles, we have this place testing radical and prototype aircraft, this one testing biological viruses, chemical warfare, and possibly even alien autopsies and alien viruses, and this installation with a vast underground chamber where reputedly it's the hub of the British government's UFO studies, and it's all in the county of Wiltshire and quite literally surrounded by crop circles. You know, I mean, even outside Porton Down and the surrounding hills, you know, you're just dominated by military installations and crop formations. And I don't necessarily think, you know, that is a coincidence. You know, I think there's some sort of connection. Something's possibly telling us something. Maybe it's concerned about the whole proliferation of what's going on at this particular area. Now, I mentioned that I'm going to get into a couple of areas that a lot of people won't necessarily know a great deal about. I wrote a book last year on a subject that in the UFO field, it makes some people excited, interested, intrigued. Other people moan, groan and roll their eyes, and that's the Contactee movement, which is very much a movement, I guess, of the 1950s and 60s, where a lot of people, particularly in the US, claimed literal face-to-face contact with very human-like extraterrestrials. They were often described as having, and even the men, having like heads of long blonde hair, which of course, you know, you wouldn't see in the US for the most part in the 1950s, and very often wearing these sort of one-piece ski suit type outfits. And the movement, if you like, was dominated by several characters, probably the most well-known one being George Adamski, others being George Van Tassel, Truman Bethurum, various people like that, and who claimed highly controversial and in some cases unbelievable sounding stories of interaction and face-to-face meetings with aliens at desert locations. One being this one, Giant Rock in California, which is called Giant Rock because it's a giant rock. And if I was to stand next to that, I'd probably come to, hang on, why is that not working? Anyway, the bit that's broken off, I'll probably be just under halfway up that. So, you know, it's like about a 35, 40 foot high rock. And George Van Tassel claimed that's where he had these experiences with these so-called long-haired space brothers. And he put a conference on every year, which at the height of its popularity was attracting audiences of 10,000 out in the desert in the mid-1950s. And he also built this place called the Integratron, which was supposedly, according to Van Tassel, a device or a construction built on the word of the Space Brothers that would possess a technology to rejuvenate the human body and lengthen the human lifespan. But unfortunately, Van Tassel died of old age before he could finish it, which is a little bit ironic. But the point I'm coming to with this is that we actually have a number of reports which sound suspiciously like encounters with these long-haired space brothers in the crop circles. Now, you know, as I said, this does get into highly controversial areas that we don't usually hear much spoken about within the crop circle movement. Now, there are a couple of cases I'm going to mention to you where I'm going to have to quote, because I'm quoting from a newspaper first. In a March 2009 article titled "Dog Walker Met UFO Alien with Scandinavian Accent," which isn't a headline you hear very often, I guess, journalist Sarah Knapton wrote in the pages of Britain's highly respected Daily Telegraph newspaper that the British Ministry of Defence had then recently released into the public domain, via the terms of the nation's Freedom of Information Act, a number of formally classified files on UFOs. One of those files, said Knapton, detailed the account of a dog walker who claimed she met a man from another planet who said aliens were responsible for crop circles. Now, of course, that's a simplistic, shrink down of the story. So the story went, the anonymous woman had telephoned the Royal Air Force Base at Wattisham, Suffolk, which is on the east coast of England, in a state of considerable distress and with a remarkable tale to tell. As the woman told the operator at the base, the incident in question had occurred while she was walking a pet dog on a sports field close to her home near the city of Norwich, about 10:30 p.m. on the night of November 20, 1989. She had been approached by a man with a, quote, Scandinavian-type accent who was dressed in a light brown garment like a flying suit. Royal Air Force documentation on the case notes the following. He asked her if she was aware of stories about large circular flattened areas appearing in fields of wheat, and then went on to explain that he was from another planet similar to Earth and that the circles had been caused by others like him who had travelled to Earth. Now, this story, highly controversial, but it deeply parallels the original Contactee stories, where they would supposedly just choose people at random and relate and impart information, wisdom about the Earth, about alien visitations. And this is supposedly what happened with this particular woman. And the man assured the woman the aliens were friendly, but that, quote, they were told not to have contact with humans for fear that they would be considered a threat, which I guess shows they've got a lot of common sense. So. And, quote, the woman left completely terrified by the encounter. As she ran away, she just thought that, it was a strange guy. Heard a loud buzzing noise and saw this, quote, large glowing orange-white spherical object rising vertically from behind a group of trees, which then shot away into the sky. So this, to the best of my knowledge, is the first kind of space brother encounter that we have reported in the crop circles, but it's certainly not the last one. There's a very strange one occurred in 1990 involving a woman named Vanessa Martin, who, because 1989, 1991 was the era when it really all took off in Britain. She spent a couple of weeks in crop circle country in Wiltshire and had an experience with another of these characters she described as having like long blonde hair and wearing this weird one-piece ski suit type outfit. And she said she was walking around the town or the village of Avebury. Avebury is a very old, ancient little area, and it has this huge circle of standing stones. I think everybody, when you think of stone circles in England, you automatically think of Stonehenge, which is certainly the biggest and the most famous, but there's literally hundreds of stone circles in England which kind of go from this sort of diameter and this height up to, the huge stones of Stonehenge. And she said this man came up to her, and she said he described his name as something like Heoki or Hoyaki. She couldn't remember exactly which. And he basically began talking to her about crop circles and relating a lot of spiritual wisdom about the nature of the formations and how an alien intelligence was trying to get a message across to us that we should change our ways and live in peace and harmony with one another. The next day, she went to Stonehenge, which, as you can see, famous Stonehenge, everybody knows Stonehenge. And she said quite literally at the edge of the road, she just turned round and this guy was stood next to her again. Didn't see him walk up, just appeared to have appeared literally out of nowhere. And she listened carefully as he again went on this talk, I guess, and lecture. Almost she felt as if he was speaking to her and her alone. And she asked a number of other people after again he suddenly vanished if they'd seen him, and they kind of looked at her strange. Nobody obviously had seen him. But again, it sounded almost like he was on a mission to convert someone to become deeply interested in the phenomenon. Then they would go out and spread the alien word, if you like. And that again parallels what was going on in the 50s and 60s with the contactees. But what's intriguing is the name of this entity that she gave, where she said Heoki or Hoyeki, which is actually very similar to Heoka. Now, Heoka is a magical trickster style being that's a part of the culture, folklore and mythology of a Native American Indian tribe called the Lakota, which is the westernmost of the three Sioux groups that occupy the land in North and South Dakota. And to the Lakota people, Heoka is basically a jester who uses laughter to heal, but he plays tricks and games on people, and by doing so tries to provoke people into thinking about things in an unconventional fashion. That's their history, folklore and mythology and teachings. So it's kind of strange that this unusual character who simply manifested out the blue with a very similar name should talk about very similar, deeply spiritual issues in relation to crop circles. So again, this is an area that we don't hear a great deal about. Now, that's a place called Chartley Castle. You remember the picture I put on at the beginning, that one? Chartley Castle is in the county of Staffordshire, as I mentioned earlier, not too far from where I used to live. And when that particular formation appeared in 2006, I was over in England, stayed at my dad's place for a couple of weeks, and so had to drive up there to check it out. And it's a pretty big crop circle, quite intricate. You know, it's only a straightforward circle, but the actual design is quite a good one. Went out to the field, had a good look at it. The strangest thing of all about this crop formation wasn't so much the circle, it was what was in the circle. There were 5 peacock feathers laid out in like a pentagon fashion, and that's one of them which I collected and took home. That's the edge of the field. If we go back to that one, the picture's kind of taken from where the long grass, if you can see it, kind of ends. Now, people say, well, what on earth is a pentagram-shaped peacock formation doing in a crop circle? Again, not something you hear very much about, but there are cases where we go into crop circles, we find crop circles, and there seems to be evidence. You can look at it 2 ways. You could argue, as some people have, that this formation was made by humans who were practicing some sort of ancient rite and ritual. Now, the peacock actually, I know this is kind of getting off into sort of weird areas, but the peacock actually plays a big role in ancient mythology. The tail is the emblem of an evil eye or an ever-vigilant traitor. And according to the tale, Argus, the chief minister of Osiris, the king of Egypt, when the king started on an Indian expedition, he left his queen Isis regions, and Argus was to be her chief advisor. Argus, with 100 spies, soon made himself so powerful and formidable, he shut up the queen regions in a strong castle and proclaimed himself king. Mercury marched against him, took his prisoner and cut off his head, whereupon Juno metamorphosed Argus into a peacock and set his eyes on its tail. So it's, in other words, the peacock's tail is an evil eye. And we had these 5 evil eyes, if you like, laid out in a perfect pentagon formation in the crop circle. Now, as I said, you can look at it 2 ways. Either that formation was made by people and somebody was engaged in some sort of ancient rite and ritual, which does go on in a lot of the little English towns and villages. You know, people think, you know, modern day society, but you get out of some of the big cities and towns and you go back into the little villages where things haven't really changed for, 100, 150 years. And it is kind of going into like the Hound of the Baskervilles or something. You know, it is like going back in time. And you do find some of these ancient traditions are still practiced. So, I suspect that something was going on like that in this formation. Or the other theory that some people have suggested, which is kind of intriguing, is that that's a genuine formation, but somebody else, I guess, hijacked it. Occultists hijacked it for their own motivations. Now, again, this isn't something we hear a great deal about. There are a few stories and rumours about occult goings-on within crop circles, but again, that doesn't necessarily mean that people who are doing it actually constructed the formations. You know, a lot of people go into crop circles and have a very positive affirmation and experiences. You know, this could be a totally negative one that somebody on the other side did. But again, I present it to you to demonstrate that, you know, crop circles, the phenomenon isn't just black and white, it's this or it's that. We have these weird offshoots to the phenomenon as well, where, you know, it seems it's open season for pretty much anything to occur. And I wrote up that story in one of my books, There's Something in the Woods, although that case was There's Something in the Fields, I guess. Then we come to the most controversial aspect of all, the human elements of crop circles. No, don't laugh. That's Matthew Williams. Matthew lives in Wiltshire. He was the very first, and I think the only person in Britain ever, to be arrested, charged and convicted for making a crop circle, although the actual charge was causing criminal damage to a field. Now, of course, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, I don't want people to get the wrong point of view. If people ask me, do I believe there's a definitive alien by non-human aspect to crop circles, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind. You know, I quoted those MI5 files from the Second World War. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind no one was running around making crop circles in the Second World War when bombs were dropping all across Europe. You know, to me that's just idiotic. But one of the things we find is if you dig into the crop circle making community, in other words, you know, not just the mysterious paranormal or extraterrestrial aspect of the crop circles, but the human angle, you find something that doesn't get spoken about very often. Now, of course, a lot of people, when you think about human beings, what do we normally call people who make crop circles?
Artists.
Or hoaxers. Most people, well, artists, that's a good one, but most people do call them hoaxers, you know, crop circle hoaxers. Media do, and most of the UFO community do. If you actually speak with a lot of the people who make the formations, you're quite right. Some of them can call themselves artists. Others, in private, will talk about things that in public they won't talk about. And one of these things is that many of the people, like Matthew, who have made crop circles and have openly admitted to it and have even been carted off down the police station for doing it, they have had, I guess, what you could call paranormal experiences in the crop formations that they made. Now that sounds strange. There are people who, for example, have gone in crop circles and, you know, they felt energized. They've had sinus problems or, you know, sore throats, and they felt radically improved, you know, rejuvenated, re-energized from going in crop circles. People have actually had that in the formations made by people as well. Now, Matthew and a number of other crop circle makers have actually stated on the record that they believe that although they are playing a role in the making of the formation, they actually feel that they're being channeled by some sort of non-human intelligence to make these formations. Now, of course, this gets really convoluted, where we may have a genuine alien intelligence that has the power using something from elsewhere to create these formations, but is actually using human beings as a vessel as well to also make formations. That is when we get into some very strange, almost esoteric areas, I guess you could say. Now, Matthew has experienced missing time. Matthew made one formation where he saw 3 of these strange balls of light suddenly shoot across and hover over it. And this was one of the few things that really freaked him out, and he just left the formation. He didn't go back into it. He felt these things were almost, you know, boring into his soul. You know, they were just hovering over him, and he felt very sort of paranoid and concerned by it, and just left the field. And we get this in a number of the crop circle makers, that they go out there not to hoax people. Most of the crop circle makers don't go out there to pull the wool over people's eyes and rub their hands together and say, yeah, we fooled you. Although that is the image that the media creates. Now, certainly some have done that. There's no doubt about that. You know, there's the angle of, yeah, let's have a bit of fun and poke fun at these UFO researchers. But I'll just tell you, I'll quote you words from Matthew so you can understand where he's coming from and how it puts the human angle in a totally different light. Matthew started doing research in 1994, and as 95, 96 went by, he said, what I learned next was totally unexpected, as the crop circle makers I spoke to did not debunk the theories that paranormal events take place in crop circles, even if they are man-made. Indeed, there was much talk of strange lights and events happening to the crop circle makers while they made crop circles at night. And he continues, the synchronistic events which happen each year in the unfolding designs that the crop circle makers come out with are often remarked as being too much of a coincidence. Crop circle designs have been repeated in different parts of the country by teams who didn't share designs beforehand. There have even been teams who have gone out on the same night to the same field, made designs not knowing the other team was present, and their designs have had very close similarities. The chances of this happening without planning are slim, so it would appear that something paranormal is working for the crop circle makers. Now, he asks the question, why do crop circles seem to manifest in this way? Why do they seem to have this ability? And he says, I know that crop is a living medium. Unlike any other type of canvas that an artist may use, crop has a life force energy, which when used on such a large scale, makes crops blend natural earth energy magic with human energy magic. What crop circle makers may have discovered is the ancient art of natural magic, working with large emblems as part of the energy system of the earth. Take sacred sites such as stone circles. These were erected as temples for people to visit, perhaps as part of a sacred quest seeking answers. Today, crop circles fill a similar role, attracting people who ask questions and putting visitors closer to paranormal sources. And he continues or concludes, when they're making these particular formations, the appearance of many he basically concludes that by going into the formations and like putting a positive affirmation on the formation and calling down what he believes is this energy, whatever it may be, that is using human beings as a vehicle to get its message across, that it somehow instills this positive energy in the formations. So, in other words, this, to my mind, doesn't sound like the work of someone, as many people believe from the media interpretation, who is a hoaxer. He's somebody who feels deeply in touch with the earth, who believes he's doing something positive, but equally feels the message isn't necessarily coming direct from his mind, it's coming from something else, which ironically may be responsible for the anomalous formations that aren't made by people. And of course this, demonstrates why the whole phenomenon is so convoluted and weird, because we have the potential, whoever it is up there doing it, we have people down here, we have these occult aspects to it as well, which all somehow seem to be tied into one unified mystery or puzzle. And of course the challenge is to get to the bottom of that. Now, I mentioned at the start of the lecture how we have evidence of early reports from MI5 investigating UFOs in the Second World War. We also have reports of crop circles from centuries ago. Now, I've used this picture because you specifically cannot see the circle. The reason I've put that there is to demonstrate the sheer size of some of these formations when the corn's laid down. Very often you see these formations in a magazine and, it's difficult to get the size of these things. But when you see people sitting in them, and the picture just goes on and on and on. That's the famous Silbury Hill in Wiltshire behind it. You see the absolute scale of some of these formations. And again, the idea that some of these highly intricate ones are made by people in minutes or overnight when there are teams of other people out looking for them, to me, that's just not feasible. And I think that's why we do have two things going on. And of course, you can argue that the UFO phenomenon uses human beings in other aspects of the phenomenon. For example, somebody will see a UFO land or come down, other people will be abducted, and then they may develop, as a lot of people have done, an interest in the planet, in the ecology. Some people turn vegetarian. So in other words, we have a phenomenon that interacts with us physically in the sense that we see it, but it also seems to get into our minds, in some people's minds, and radically puts them on new pathways. You could argue that's exactly what it's doing with the crop circles. It's manifesting them itself, but it's also altering the mindset of certain people to play a role in the phenomenon also. Now, one of the very earliest examples we have of a crop circle is this thing that's become known famously as the mowing devil. Now, this was presented on what was known as a woodcut. It was actually done in 1678, and it's titled The Mowing Devil, or Strange News out of Hertfordshire. Hertfordshire is an English county. And as you can see, there's like this area of flattened ground at the bottom, and this little black-coloured goblin-type creature that's, I guess, flattening the corn. And as you can see, he's got like a scythe in his hand, so he's cutting it down as well. This to me is sort of a fascinating story. It talks about this particular formation having been found, and of course, you know, the skeptics say, well, somebody was just out flattening the corn for something to do, which, you know, I don't know why you would just go out and flatten corn for the sake of it, but that was one of the, you know, the skeptics' views. What's interesting, though, is that in this particular document, I won't read it to you because it's written in like a really old style of English. Several hundred years ago, English was actually quite difficult to understand, and it's changed over the last few centuries, the spoken and written word. But the formation, the text that describes the formation talks about how the farmer the night before had seen the field, quote, all aflame. In other words, there was some sort of bright light in the field or over the field, and the next day that formation was there. Now, the little guy, the document doesn't talk about the little guy having been seen in the field, but the presumption was that it was made by some sort of non-human being or entity. And to me, this is probably one of the most important documents that we have on crop circles, because we can validate that it's more than 300 years old. We can validate that it was a crop circle-like phenomenon. We can validate that it was associated with a little being, which, you know, could it have been a grey? You know, who knows? And it was tied in with some sort of anomalous light that was seen over the field. Now, this becomes all the more intriguing when about 10 years ago I spent some time down at the National Archives in England, where the MI5 files I talked about earlier originated, and I found another document which talked about somebody who'd seen a crop circle, or found a crop circle, and the night before the field had been almost literally all aflame. And I'll quote this document for you because it's an important one, because again it's historical and it dates long before the modern day phenomenon of crop circle was even known about. Now this is a letter dated March the 23rd, 1964, and it was written by a priest who was based in the town of Penrith, Cumbria, which is in the north of England, just before the Scottish border. And he wrote to the Ministry of Defence, "Does an apparent column of blue light, about 8 feet in diameter and about 15 feet high, which disappears and leaves a mark of very slightly disturbed earth, the same diameter, mean anything to you? I examined the ground, which is about 100 yards from the nearest building, and there are no pylons near. There was no sign of burning, either by sight or smell. The grass growing between the exposed ground appeared quite normal. There were no signs of bird tracks or droppings. The ground simply appeared to have been lightly raked over in an almost perfect circle." So again, in 1964, we have farmland, a perfect circle, but the night before, this weird column of electric blue light hovering over the field, which, you know, to me, I have no idea what that could have been. 8 feet in diameter and 15 feet high is a pretty substantial size. You know, we're not talking about somebody letting off a flare or something like that. And apparently it was hovering over the field for something like 15 minutes. So clearly it wouldn't have been a helicopter, it wouldn't have been an aircraft. What it was, we don't know. But in its historical context, again, this demonstrates that despite what the skeptics say, what the media would have us believe, crop circles are an old phenomenon. This one, 45 years old. So, you know, we need to place all these reports in their proper perspective. You know, when I talked about how, for example, the World War II crop circles were associated with strange balls of light, the Foo Fighters, and today we have crop circles and these little glinting balls of light over the fields, you know, people then realise, well, hang on, okay, there's a phenomenon here was seen in the 40s, maybe it then went away, then it was seen again in the 80s and 90s, but now we know it was also in existence in the 60s. So in other words, if we also go back to this one, the Mowing Devil in the 1600s, there's a very convincing argument to be made that even though the term crop circle is a relatively modern one, the phenomenon may actually have been with us for centuries and has never gone away. What I actually think has happened is two things. The phenomenon has upped the ante, if you like, in the last 20 years to where it's being seen more and more at a greater scale and is becoming more aggressive in its approach and its nature. And also we have, of course, a wider news outlet. We have the internet, you know, we have TV, we have radio. You know, back in the 1600s, in all likelihood, this story simply wouldn't have got out of the county of Hertfordshire. Nobody else would have known about it. There's no way the story would have been able to spread. And of course, in the Second World War, you know, everybody was busy fighting the Germans and vice versa. They were fighting us. Nobody was really overly concerned about crop circles beyond the worry that could they be coded messages, as MI5 concluded. So in other words, a lot of this was either put on the back burner or just wasn't known about. But if we look back into it retrospectively, we see a very ancient phenomenon which I think is screaming out to us more and more today. Now that's the Ministry of Defence, where that particular report was taken. And just to sort of demonstrate the sort of sheer pompous arrogance that you get within the Ministry of Defence and government at times, when the priests sent that report into the Ministry of Defence, they just dismissed it, and an internal memo, which has now been declassified, said the report probably had more to do with the state of the witness's liver than it did with anything else. Now, you know, on the one hand, it's kind of, you know, it makes a laugh, but on the other hand, it's insulting to a witness who in good faith tells his local priest this story, who takes the time to write to the Ministry of Defence, and then in internal memos, which they never ever guessed would be released through the Freedom of Information Act, you know, makes jokes about the witness's liver and cirrhosis, I guess, and drinking too much. So, you know, this is one of the things we're up against, a denial of even wanting to look at the phenomenon. Now, of course, this goes solely against MI5's angle. They were deeply interested. So this leads me to believe that there's sort of a compartmentalisation of material within the government. What the Ministry of Defence doesn't know doesn't necessarily mean another arm of the intelligence community didn't have a deep awareness that something was going on. I think that is the case. Now you might wonder, I do lectures on cryptozoology, strange creatures at times. You might think I put this picture in this particular lecture by mistake, but I actually haven't. I've got 4 reports on file where people have seen either large exotic looking cats or big black cats literally inside British crop circles. Now I have no way to explain that. There are no sort of large big cats that are indigenous to the British Isles, but every year people do see them. There's certain ones known as the Beast of Exmoor, the Beast of Dartmoor, the Beast of Bodmin, and people back in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of people did keep big cats as pets, and then the government introduced new legislation where they had to pay a hefty amount of money for to keep these animals and have them registered. A lot of people couldn't afford it, so they'd go out to the woods at night and release their animals into the wild, and they thrive quite nicely. So today, these reports of big cats on the loose in Britain are genuine. There's no doubt about that. But we get a lot, so I won't say a lot, I know of 4 reports where people have claimed sightings of big cats in English crop circles. And again, I have no way to explain how or why that could be. The only argument that's come forward actually came from a big cat expert who I spoke to once, who said, you know, he wondered because animals, you know, with their wavelengths, hearings, etc., are far more in tune with vibrations and higher levels of stimuli, etc., than we are. And maybe, you know, because some people have talked about crop circles and these strange high frequency noises and vibratory sounds, could it be that some of these animals are literally attracted to whatever is creating these unknown audio sounds. So, that's speculation, I'll be the first to admit, but it's probably the best argument that's been put forward. So I hope I've kind of got across to you, I guess, certainly not the full story. I wouldn't be arrogant enough to say I've presented the full story of the crop circle mystery, but my own, I won't say even conclusions, but the findings that I've had going out on sort of road trip investigations into crop circles, thinking it was going to be straightforward, just nuts and bolts UFOs creating crop circles, but finding a lot of other strange, deep and weird aspects. The whole issue of the contactee angle, the MI5 files, the old 1600 mowing devil woodcut, the issue of the peacock formation and the occult, what sounds like rites and rituals going on, the human makers seemingly being driven and directed by some unearthly force and channeled almost, and genuine formations where you have these lights in the sky hovering over the fields, and then lo and behold the next day you have this intricate pattern. So in conclusion, I would say that the phenomenon overall is an anomalous one, and it's not directed by human beings, and most of it isn't even undertaken, I don't think, by human beings, and even when it is, it's tied into this aspect. As far as the whys, the wherefores as to what this all means, I would say, ironically, I'm still going around in circles, but all we can continue to do is look for answers. I think something is giving us clues to something, and it wants us to find the answers. It doesn't want us to be lazy human beings with everything put on the plate and given to us. I think it runs deeper, and I think to an extent we're listening, but it's trying to spread the message further and further and deeper, and that's why in the last 10, 20 years we've seen an increase in the message, if you like. So I hope that's kind of given you an inkling into some of the known aspects and some of the lesser known aspects of the crop circle mystery. And in the 11 minutes we've got left, if anybody's got any questions, I'll be glad to try and answer them. Thanks a lot.
You say you're living in Texas right now, and that's where I was raised.
I'm sorry?
I was raised there. I was raised just outside of the Big Thicket, which is in the eastern side part of the state. And we have out there a phenomenon that is called a laydown. Have you ever heard of this?
No.
It's where all the pine trees lay down in a huge area. And meteorologists have tried to say it's something like a plow wind that comes through and lays everything down, but it really is quite a strange phenomenon out in that area.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because in the Big Thicket also they have a story of something called the Ghost Light. There's actually a place called Bragg Road that runs through the Big Thicket, and it's known locally as Ghost Light Road. So there's another location where you've got flattened areas and weird little ghost lights.
And there's lots of black cat stories from where I was
there
raised too.
Yeah.
So you could probably figure out the plow winds and the black cats all in the same area without having to leave the state.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Thanks.
So good luck with that. I'll be looking for the book.
All right.
Hello. How common is it to find crop circles only partially finished?
Oh, that's actually a good question. Most crop circles are very, very intricate, and they look perfect. It's actually, when you're seeing these formations in a photograph, they look perfect. There are some that are less so, but in terms of actual massive mistakes, that's not in the majority. It's actually in the minority. And if you were to ask me what that means, I think the minority of ones where there are mistakes, they're done by people. But when you have some of these really intricate ones and massive formations, where it looks like a mathematical, creation, and it's just perfect, it's difficult to believe that a person could do that, even a team of people, because what a lot of people don't realise is that a lot of farmers don't like crop circles being made. And so they have teams of people patrolling the fields at night. So in other words, you don't have to just get away with making it under the cover of darkness. You've got to be careful a farmer doesn't shoot you with his shotgun or whatever. Guns aren't widely available in England, but farmers can have them, to protect their livestock from foxes and things. So, everybody and his brother's out there trying to stop people making the formations, and yet most of them are pretty perfect. So.
They're actually circle makers making extra money guarding the crops.
Yeah. It's again, it's farmers don't like it for the most part, because a lot of people don't realise if a crop circle's made, if the farmer gets out in time, they can actually lower the blades of the machines and they can reap the crop. But if people go in and sort of trample it really flat and whatever, then that can cause problems. Some farmers realise there's nothing they can do about it, so they just charge people at the gate to go in to make up for the money they're not going to get from being able to cut the crops.
Two things. One of them that you mentioned, kind of presenting the message as a mystery. Mm-hmm. That reminds me a lot of how like Zen lessons are presented. Mm-hmm. They're presented as a paradox or a mystery or an unanswerable question just to get you thinking. Yeah,
I mean, there's nothing worse than, if you do something for somebody too much, they never do anything on their own.
If you give someone an answer.
It's like the baby's got to fall out of his his crib now and again to realise if you hit the floor, you're going to hurt yourself,
But the question I had, you mentioned the kind of the paranormal sensitivity or the paranormal guidance or whatever of some of the circle makers. Have you looked into the background of some of the circle makers? Do they have paranormal history or experience or history or
some of them does.
Family line history or anything like that?
Matthew Williams, I'll put on screen, does. Others don't. Some of them just didn't have any interest beforehand, and then it was out of the blue that they started to develop this interest after they were sort of exposed to the phenomenon, as if it basically said, I'm going to choose you. For whatever reason. And that is something you find, is that a lot of people in the subject, whether it's the UFO subject or crop circles, are drawn to it for reasons that they don't necessarily understand. It just hits them like that, which again is perhaps an indication that, something has basically just said, it's going to be you today and you tomorrow.
I would like to mention that it might be a good thing to study up a bit more on peacocks, due to the fact that the evil eye aspect of peacocks is found in Greek mythology and maybe Egyptian, but not in hardly any other subject. And in India, they are good luck animals that are used symbolically, essentially as watchdogs, because they are very easy to disturb at night and they'll scream loudly. And so they use them the same way Europeans used to use geese to warn them of problems. And they consider the eyes to be the all-seeing eyes of Brahm. So the idea that a peacock is necessarily evil eye is not at all true.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult when all we know for certain is that somebody got the peacock feathers in association with the crop circle. We don't know what was necessarily going through their minds. And of course, it's kind of difficult. Well, that's true, it might. Yeah. And of course, it's the other question is, of course, how on earth do you get hold of 5 peacock feathers in England on a Friday night or whatever? It's not. What's that?
Well, you said it was a pretty good.
Yeah, they were obviously taken from the same bird or a couple of birds, but I mean, peacocks for the most part aren't running around England. People be crashing the cars if somebody saw a peacock crossing the road or whatever. So.
Many of us have seen a video of a couple of orbs moving around a field and then the formation forming immediately. Is that officially a hoax or not?
A lot of people think it is a hoax. Other people said it's not a hoax. It's. I think I know which one you mean, because there actually are a couple.
There's a Photoshop.
There was a Photoshop one. Then somebody else said that wasn't the one they saw originally. That was like a follow-up, and that the original one never surfaced again. Is that correct?
But they show the Photoshop video makers actually created.
Yeah. There's definitely one out there that is photoshopped, but I know that other people have said, well, there was another one as well that was based.
There have been some people, though, have actually observed, watched the field, and see it formed.
Yeah, there are a few. There's actually a recent one where Colin Andrews had got a witness where somebody talked about seeing sort of this fog over the field, but it wasn't touching the base of the field. It was kind of raised up, and then this formation was kind of being made. There are a couple of people who said they heard this intense buzzing sound in the fields and saw a formation being made. And then, of course, we've got these other ones where, like the previous night, people saw these lights, like this electric blue column of light, or the one with the mowing devil light. So, you know, I think there's something anomalous making the formations. Now, you know, it's like any aspect of the UFO subject. Unfortunately, you do get hoaxes, and unfortunately the hoaxes sometimes attract more attention than they should. Well, you know, they shouldn't really attract any attention. You know, we should be focusing on the good stuff. But that does happen, and it kind of muddies the waters. But I always say to people, you know, for every bad case, there's 10 good ones, and we should focus on those 10 good ones.
Well, thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Have you come across the meanings associated with the different patterns?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different meanings with crop circles. You know, there's a lot of, or some patterns at least, have been associated with Gaia, like the idea that the Earth is a sort of living entity. You know, this is why it's attracted so much attention, the idea that maybe, you know, we're this sort of parasitic race that probably does more damage to the planet than anything's done in the entire history of the planet. You know, what do? We pull all the planet's resources, you know, and we don't really put much back. We cut down the forests and destroy things, and all we do is reproduce and take more and more. You know, if you take the approach that the Earth could be a conscious entity, you know, you could want to do one of two things: get rid of us, or try and change us. And maybe, you know, you could argue that because some of these formations seem to have these messages attached to them, you know, getting us to think about life and that there's more to our existence, and, you know, let's not just be a bunch of users and abusers and put something back. You know, it's kind of, the other angle would be that film, what was it called, that the guy who made Signs did, when the trees when they release some sort of spore and it makes everybody commit suicide. The Happening. You know, that's the one approach, is like the Gaia approach, that the Earth would fight back. But maybe the Earth's being a bit more, I guess, mindful, and giving us the chance to come around to, you know, its way of thinking. But I mean, others sort of, there's mathematical equations, you know, things connected with ancient races, you know, pi, formula, that sort of thing. So, yeah, there's a lot of thought-provoking patterns, and I think, you know, as the one man who came up said, maybe they're trying to actually not even have a definitive answer, just get us thinking about things beyond just, you know, being stuck in one mindset. So. And the screen just says time's up. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you all. That does conclude.